Today's headline is The Meanest Man. The subheadline says, How Joe Schwartz Fleeced a Kansas City Pawnbroker. It says, Once upon a time, said a Western detective, I had a friend named Joe Schwartz. Joe was as crooked as a dog's hind leg. His specialty was painting diamonds. He would take an ordinary crystal, and by the time he had got through with it, you would think it was the Kohinoor. But it was not about Joe's diamond painting I was thinking. It was another little trick he turned. Joe lived in Kansas City and does yet if his residence has not been changed to the penitentiary. Down in the bottoms below the bluff, in the city by the Kaw, there abode a Polander by the name of Witkowski. Witkowski was from Warsaw, and doubtless his ancestors shrieked when Kosciuszko fell. After the family alarm at the fall of Warsaw's last champion had subsided, they evidently emigrated. At any rate, their descendant, as stated, had business and social existence in that part of Kansas City known as the Bottoms. As a way to live, he kept a pawn shop and he knew Joe Schwartz. One day, Witkowski came to Joe and explained how ignorant he was on the subject of watches, and he also told Joe he had frequent opportunities to loan money on watches, and if Joe were willing, he would like to form an agreement of a friendly sort, whereby he could bring these proffered watches to him and learn their value before he loaned money on them. Joe, too, kept a great big pawn shop and second-hand jewelry store on Main Street in Kansas City. After knitting his brows, he advised Witkowski not to loan money on watches, but in every possible instance, buy the timepiece outright. Joe advised, as Witkowski had himself suggested, that as a primary step, he bring all watches to him. He would tell Witkowski their exact value and just what he could afford to pay for them. Witkowski returned. Joe had about 2 bushels of cheap silver watches which he had bought from some Connecticut company outright to make a part of his stock. These watches had not been a good sale. They were a very cheap silver-plated sort. The next day, Joe, through an agent not known to Witkowski, sent 5 of these watches to be sold. Witkowski deferred purchasing until the next day, meanwhile insisting on being allowed to bring the watches uptown to be valued. The man said he had several hundred of them. Joe looked at them and told Witkowski he could easily afford to pay $15 apiece for the watches, that he, Schwartz, would take them off his hands at $17.50 and buy all he could of them. Witkowski was delighted. He went back and invested all the money he had and bought some 90 old watches at $15 each. He was to make $2.50 profit on them by selling them to Schwartz for $17.50. This would be a nice thing for Witkowski. He slept well that night. The next day he went up to see Schwartz and told him he had purchased about 2 pecks of these watches and paid the man $15 each for them. He now stood ready to transfer them to Schwartz at an advance of $2.50 per watch. Schwartz said he would be glad to get them and that it was all right. But, said he, sinking his voice to a whisper full of gloomy forebodings, since you were here, some detectives have been in here looking over my stock. They report a big robbery of watches in the East. They say that over 1,000 silver watches were stolen from a factory in Connecticut. They have left the numbers of the watches and description. I hope none of these watches you have bought are part of this robbery, but we can very soon tell, as I took a list of the numbers from the detective. Witkowski felt a little chilly after this, and chillier still when after investigation, it was discovered that Joe had the number of every watch in his possession. It was indubitable proof to Witkowski that he had been buying stolen goods. Joe told him that he must wash his hands of this transaction and could not possibly buy the watches at any price, that he was afraid that he would get into the penitentiary if he touched them. Witkowski wrung his hands and tore his hair. He was ruined. At last Joe, pretending great sympathy for Witkowski, and because, as he confessed, he had a way of working them off that Witkowski didn't possess and could therefore handle them with more safety, concluded to risk $5 a watch. It thus transpired that Joe gave Witkowski about $500 and recovered back his own watches, which the day before he had sold off on Witkowski for $1,500. When the matter ended, the sage Joseph had his watches again and about $1,000 of the money of trusting Witkowski. Warsaw had fallen again. This article originally came from the Washington Star. This story comes from the great state of Pennsylvania, being reported in the Philadelphia Inquirer of September 29, 1895. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.